Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another Archon's Alternatives. Today we'll be talking about Warhammer Fantasy and specifically Chaos Weaponry, various Chaos weapons and the weapons of the High Northern Norscan tribes. In addition, this will be the start to a new series on the channel, and a bit of a 40k crossover in addition to being an alternatives video. So, the Chaos series is just going to be related to specific Chaos fields that we're going to be going into, whether it's worship, whether it's weaponry, whether it's equipment, and a lot of the videos that we've already done will be put into this playlist for folks. So, Old World Chaos. Chaos beyond the 41st millennium in Warhammer Fantasy. Now, we will be focusing on the Old World, not only because the Old World is my personal preference, but also because the Old World organizes and explains the realms of Chaos, and more specifically the realms of humanity within Chaos, Norsca and the Great Northern Lands, in a much more coherent and reasonable way than the New Lore does. So, Old World Chaos works very similar to what we know about in 40k. It's a connection between mankind and the gods, where the gods are fueled by the actions of mankind in releasing souls and energy into the realm of Chaos, or really, it's not the warp in Old World Chaos, it's merely the realms, or the kingdoms of Chaos, depending upon what your definition of the ways are, but beyond the portals and beyond the mad creatures of Chaos that exist within the Northern Wastes, we also have humans, living and thugging it out in the frozen tundras of Norsca and the far northern wastes of Chaos. And, of course, they need to arm themselves, because if they're going to kill Kislevitz in style, or murder anyone else who happens to be in the local vicinity who is less based than they are, they need weaponry. But how do we classify these things? Anything from the visible here rusty axe that an overweight man with an ugly helmet is using, the stabby bits and blades on the armor of a Slaneshi warrior, or the chosen of chaos weapons that are multiple enchanted or demon-laced blades and armor sets. How do we set them apart, and what is the line between them? How are they made? What are they used for, and why do you want them? Well, I split chaos weapons of the old world into three types. The first one is traditional, and we'll be going over all of these in detail, but in terms of power level, they go traditional, ensorcelled, demonic. Now, there's specific thresholds of power and requirements to make each of these, but the most common are traditional chaos weapons. Now, there are all different types of traditional chaos weapons, but these usually take the forms of relatively normal armament. You know, swords, axes, great weapons, halberds, but there's something special about them. No matter how hard the Empire tries, and no matter how hard the Kislevitz try, they can never create the same level of toughness, the same level of durability, and the same level of sharpness that these Norscan weapons, these peasant creators with their dung-fired forges, seem to be able to make. Why is that? Well, very simply, there is a lot of tradition and history in the realms of Chaos, and of course that extends to the Norscan wastes as well. Traditional weapons could best be described as a byproduct of living and creating weapons in the waste. On occasion, the chaos corruption that is inherent in the air, the food, the wood, the water, and the metal in the land itself bleeds into a weapon in such a way that it changes its physical properties. Steel is more durable, edges are more sharp, the body of the weapon itself is both lighter and strikes harder than any weapon of similar size and make, simply because the metal is tainted. The fire that was made out of the wood that made the steel is tainted. The coal was tainted. Everything was suffused with the power of chaos, resulting in a weapon that, even though it fits perfectly similar or even inferior dimensions to its imperial or soft southern counterparts, it's simply better because of tradition, that history and legacy of chaos weaponry. The next rank up is a lot more intentional. Ensorcelled weapons are not necessarily crafted by accident or crafted by history or long tradition. Ensorcelled weapons are made for a purpose, and most often that purpose is the purpose of the gods. Ensorcelled weapons usually include some level of unnatural magic in their creation, whether that's a ritual that makes them change their properties, or a long series of steps and processes in order to make the weapon do something that simply is not possible. While the traditional chaos weapon may be difficult to explain, or, a blind squirrel finds a nut every couple of days, that might make sense why this sword is so particularly good, even though it comes from a Northskin smith, you can't explain away ensorcelled weapons. You can't explain why this whip that the Norskins were using seems to be alive and actively seeking out flesh to cut. You can't explain why this blade is weeping pus and acid, or why this sword is constantly screaming. It's not even that it's a dangerous thing or a particularly powerful enchantment on the ensorcelled weapon. It just has to be something unexplainable. Something that's factually impossible in terms of what a weapon is. Why does this weapon keep lighting on fire for no reason? Ensorcelled weaponry. Now, there's various different types, we'll go into it in detail, but let's stop off at the last type, which is demonic weaponry. This is, in Warhammer Fantasy, weapons directly from the hells, weapons directly from the realm of the gods, either spat out as gifts to the champion involved, or literally taken from demons. Now, obviously, Khorne is responsible for a large number of these. His axes, his random pieces of metal that happen to be dropped into reality when his demons are bested or anything of that nature, and more likely than not, just gifts to his actual followers will often fall under the demonic trait, and these go beyond just being unexplainable. They break the fabric of reality. They do things that is absolutely not possible and are quite powerful. A sword that spits lightning, an axe that has a chain blade in it, some things that are absolutely not possible and practically go against physics and reality. There is great magic within these weapons, and often it's automatic. Unlike ensorcelled weapons, which might need to be re-enchanted, re-upped, or lose their benefit over time, demonic weapons do not, and often some of them are full-on sentient, pushing the wielder towards actions or decisions that please their benefactor, even if that warrior wasn't doing that already. So, what we'll be going over today? Well, very simply, what it is. So, what each weapon is, how it forms in armor, ranged weapons, melee weapons, how it's done, how do you make each of these types of weapons, and what is the reach, what are the limits, what is bad about each type of weapon, and what is good about them. So we'll be going over all of that. But one last stop off before we go right into the traditional weapons is why it matters in the old world and the new world and in 40k. Well, for the old world, these weapons are basically how the Norskins have been so unbelievably successful time and time again. If the Norskins were forced to be at the actual level of technology that they're at, and they were limited to basically tribalistic methods in order to make weaponry, they would very simply have been wiped out a long time ago. They are not incredibly numerous, and while they do gather in large numbers to assault their southern enemies, without the improvements, that is, the blessings of their gods and the natural profit of the land with those traditional chaos weapons, they would likely have been overcome, or at least be much easier to repel. So these make up a huge advantage for the Norskins and for the Chaos tribes when it comes to fighting against the South in the Old World. In the New World, well, order versus chaos. It is one of the most lopsided fights in the New World. It's rare. in my experience, that the New World is very fair to traditional chaos, especially to unorganized humans. So, unless you're a chosen of chaos, you've got a very, very raw deal a vast majority of the time. Again, that's my personal experience, and my knowledge of the New World is not as extensive as the Old World, but, the Hmong, the Hung, the various other northern tribes would be in a much worse state in the New World than they would be in the Old, because there simply isn't as much respect or, let's say, granularity taken with these specific acts like creating chaos weaponry or forming warbands, etc. Simply isn't as varied as it used to be. How the mighty have fallen. But let's not lament. Why does this matter for 40k? And I promise, for those of you who asked for Warhammer Fantasy, this is the last time I will mention Warhammer 40k, the 41st Millennium. Why does it matter for 40k? Well, all of these classifications, and to a great degree, all of these facts, also apply directly to the 41st Millennium. We may not have traditional chaos weapons in the classic sense. For example, Chaos Corruption could technically give you something equivalent to traditional chaos weaponry, but that's relatively difficult to do, and given the prolific nature of ranged weapons in the 41st Millennium, well, you'll see pretty quickly that chaos weapons in general don't do as well when working on ranged weapons, because they have to be on a single target or on a unit or single conjoined piece of material. So something that uses ammunition is going to be significantly more difficult to enchant, because the ammunition is what's hitting the target and not the weapon itself. So a little bit of a different mentality there when you're talking about enchanting your autogun or ensorceling your autogun. It's going to be a very different thing, and it's probably going to be a lot harder. But most of these things do apply straight away. There are traditional ways to improve your melee weapons in 40k using Chaos Corruption. Of course, ensorcelled weapons are a thing that we already have in the hands of, for example, Zangors. And then demonic weapons within the 41st Millennium are even more prevalent, and in some cases even more powerful, than they are in the Old World. Though, honestly, you could argue that many of the Old World weapons that are demonic in nature actually are a match for a large number of Imperial weapons of the 41st Millennium, which is saying something, quite literally. So, let's get on to my personal favorite, or it ties with ensorcelled weapons. I love traditional chaos weapons. I love the idea that just being in this horrid environment, being in this long storied historical war against the South, that by itself gives the Norskin, gives the Chaos Warrior, the Chaos Champion, the chosen of the gods, a natural advantage, because, well, he was born in an ancient tribe where there is history and tradition that literally is imbued, baked, hammered, and burnt into his war gear over generations upon generations. So, how's it done? Well, generally, this is, like I said, born out of ancient materials or conditions. And the other important thing is smiths. There are occasions where there are specifically talented smiths or ritualists or tribes who know how to make traditional weapons much better and more uniformly by utilizing the fact that they're aware that the ground is tainted, the iron is tainted, the wood is tainted, so they try and find more and more corrupted pieces of their environment through which to create these weapons, and then alloying them with our next point, which is they are ritualistically important. Now, I talked about the living whip earlier. How do you get something like a living whip, even though that would be more of an ensorcelled weapon? Well, it's via this ritualism. If I have a new warrior who enters the warband and he doesn't have a traditional chaos weapon, well, he's not just going to be given one off of the forge, he's going to be a servant of chaos, a chaos warrior, a chaos knight, an actual armored leader, not some pathetic marauder. I need him to be equipped well. How's he going to do that? Well, very simple. He goes up to our clan smith, and they work together on a weapon. Let's say it's an axe. Great! he has an axe. It's a red-tempered axe. That's what we call it, a red-tempered axe. Well, how do we get it to be a red-tempered axe? When we get it out of the forge, it's just a regular weapon. It's practically normal in any visual way, even though it has that traditional chaos flair to it where it is inherently improved because of the corruption. Well, where does the ritualism come in? Well, once he completes his creation of the weapon as a chaos champion or an aspiring champion, well, he has to behead someone with it, of course. He can't just carry it into battle on his hip. He has to slaughter someone immediately while the iron is still hot. And perhaps he has to go find someone that he loves, or maybe he has to find a fellow warrior and defeat them in combat in order to christen his red blade with its bloody emblem. And there you go, a traditional chaos emblem. You didn't necessarily have to create a full-on ritual. You didn't even necessarily have to know any sorcery or magic to make this weapon better or more powerful than it should naturally be, given its relatively rough design. All you had to do was follow the steps and use equipment and materials from the realms of chaos in the far north. And of course, this has a massive benefit, and that is that traditional chaos weapons are easily replicable. I can do that over and over and over again. I can equip an entire unit of Chaos Knights with the same bloody-bladed swords, or the same head-chopping axes, or the same powerful black armor. It's all possible to be done again and again and again to make more and more of these weapons and equipment. And even with that, the only downside, the only limitation, is that sometimes it's really hard to do it quickly. The only limitation is that sometimes, because of the limitations in technology, or maybe because of the limitations in that ritualism, for example, you can't just be going around beheading people with your axe, you have to actually find an enemy who's worthy of getting killed. Quite a common thing with Norsca. I mean, they do fight amongst themselves, but a worthy enemy is a worthy enemy, whether he's a fellow Norscan, a Northerner, or a Kislevet, so there's plenty of necks to hew, but you might have to travel a few days to get to do it, which, of course, the smith is not going to have 30 or 40 axes ready to go. He's going to need some help actually stoking the forge and getting it going. Not to mention, he might not be moving around with the warband if he's a particularly important person. His forge might be set up in one place, and you have to go back to get your axe again. Now, that's the main limitation, and that's not much of a limitation. If you got enough people around and enough supplies into a warband, one smith could churn out dozens, hundreds of weapons, or dozens of sets of full armor in only a couple of months, maybe a year. So the idea of equipping a whole unit of aspiring champions in a year or so is actually not as unreachable as you might think. And if you're just equipping cheapo Norskins or any other type of random chaotic riffraff, go hell for leather. It doesn't have to be so complex or particular. If you just want traditional chaos weapons that are of a less powerful make, go right ahead. It's still made with those northern materials. It's still going to have that edge over its southern counterparts. Now, it's not to say that the warriors are better, and it's not to say that the designs are better. It's just to say that if I were to smash a Kislevet axe against a Norscan chaos axe made with tradition and traditional materials from the far north, the Kislevet's axe might break before the Norscan would. To his surprise, I'm sure. And then the other big benefit is minimal to no human sacrifice is needed. Murder might be required, not saying you might not have to kill anyone with the weapon in order to truly christen it, but no human sacrifice. I don't have to keep around a bunch of slaves and slit their throats with the blade while I'm actively making it. Not necessary. Which makes them a lot cheaper, and you don't have to spend human lives like water in order to achieve a weapon of this type. So that's just an even better benefit. Human sacrifice, not needed. The best example that I can give of the difference between a traditional sword and an ensorcelled weapon, because of course the next question will be, well, what makes a traditional chaos weapon different from an ensorcelled weapon if the chaos weapons have this very low end and then the much higher ritualistic end? Beowulf. My best example comes from Beowulf. If you've never read the legend, basically, go read the legend. There's a great free comic book on it now. There's been multiple Beowulf movies. You have no reason to not know about Beowulf. Go read. Beowulf is essentially fighting against inhuman enemies, kind of troll-like creatures with very tough hide. And he has a blade that he begins with, and his blade, his sword, Hrunting is not a bad weapon. It is a storied and traditional blade made with extreme capabilities, capable of piercing the hide of sea monsters and dangerous creatures and defeating all of Beowulf's enemies. It is a legendary sword by all rights. And yet it is a very traditional sword. It is a traditional Viking blade by all accounts, and it is known as the sword that failed because upon striking this creature, specifically Grendel's mother, the blade shatters and is destroyed by this impossible magical creature-like beast, this half-giant creature. And the sword that failed is the best example of that traditional sword. It doesn't quite get to the level of being truly magic. But what does Beowulf find in Grendel's cave? Well, he finds the Sword of the Giants. The Sword of the Giants is a good example of an ensorcelled weapon. Now, the Sword of the Giants doesn't light into flames, it doesn't make Beowulf any stronger, it doesn't give him any particular virtue that he didn't already have, but it has two particular differences from Hrunting. Well, number one, they're afraid of it. Yes, his foes, his impossible enemies, his demonic foes in this case, are afraid of the Sword of the Giants. And that gives us our first tip-off as to what makes a traditional chaos weapon different from an ensorcelled weapon. An ensorcelled weapon includes magic in its creation. Some kind of actual magic or ritual is required to differentiate a sword like Hrunting, a traditional chaos weapon, from the Sword of the Giants, which not only strikes fear into these unnatural magical enemies, but also is able to penetrate their hide and defeat them where Hrunting failed to do so. So you can see the second part of what makes an ensorcelled weapon is that it is able to go beyond the limits of normal, traditional chaos weapons. So definitely look that up. I've seen a lot of different interpretations of what Hrunting looks like versus what the Sword of Giants looks like. I personally like the version where the Sword of Giants has no tip, and it's just a giant cleaver that's two-handed. Very, very cool. But either way, a great example there from our own folklore history. Let's talk about ensorcelled weapons then, and of course this will also be the slide where we talk about armor and ranged weapons and all that type of stuff. Ensorcelled weapons are, to begin with, far more powerful than traditional chaos weapons. And you have more forms and options and changes to the physical article of the weapon. For example, the best way to tell apart a traditional chaos weapon from an ensorcelled weapon is that it will look wrong. It will look different. It will have something about it that is ungainly, abnormal, too spiky, too warbly, giving off light or heat or sensation or noise that is not possible for a normal weapon. Like, it has something about it that indicates to you by its mere visual aesthetic that it's not normal, not of this earth, not natural, and that is the smell of magic in the old world, is that it looks off, it feels off, it changes how it looks. All of these weapons, this flamberged sword, this spiky halberd that's enormous in size, this oversized club that looks like an anchor in terms of weight, all of these would be indicators of ensorcelled weapons, because who would make a sword that looked like that? Who would make a halberd that was that big, oversized, and spiky? Who would make a club that was that heavy? The answer is the gods would, and that's important about ensorcelled weapons because it changes the physical article of the weapon. When you started with 1 and you get out 2 from this equation, what is the equation? Well, what is the equation? It starts with the weapon. It doesn't require that you make a custom weapon, so you don't have to make this flamberged sword. At the start of the process, this may have just been a totally normal sword. Maybe a little runic, maybe a little bit of fancy, definitely the top end of chaos weapon, but it definitely didn't look like this. It wasn't giving off lightning, and it probably didn't have any magic powers. But at the end of the ensorcellation process, the enchanting process, if you will, now it looks like this. It is decidedly different as it has changed in its actual principle and creation. And very primary to this is that it often includes simple magical effects. Swords that light on fire, yes. Axes that become heavier as you swing them downward, yes. Blades that shriek and scream and give off light and noise. Weapons that have impossible levels of weight when swung against an enemy. Or weapons that are incredibly or impossibly light. Something that breaks not only the laws of nature or design, but also just physics straight out. These weapons can leak acid or pus or poison. They can be coated in flame, coated in slime, coated in blood, any number of things that simply defy reality to exist, the ensorcelled weapon can include. Usually not a ton of them at a time, 1 or 2. If it's 2, it'll usually be 1 that actually makes the weapon better, and then 1 that's just like a cosmetic side effect. So this would be a good example of 1. This is a sword that shocks the target when you strike it, but it also has these little visual effects of electricity. Now, this one, on the other hand, is clearly more simple, as is this one and plain. So what are their effects? This probably dramatically increases its weight or velocity when you swing it. How does that happen? No idea. It straight up denies physics, which is the point of an ensorcelled weapon. How about this one? Well, I would say that it's very likely, given that it's a halberd or a great axe, it probably parts armor like it isn't even there, giving it an increased armor penetration, essentially giving it a pseudo-power field in the old world. Quite impressive many a time. Now, let's get back to how these are made. Ensorcelled weapons will usually require magic to create magic. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to be a full-fledged wizard in order to make an ensorcelled weapon. Those Norskin smiths, some of them have the knowledge and the wherewithal to actually make ensorcelled weapons. How do they do that? Well, they follow a very simple, straightforward process to formulate a chaos ritual. I go out on the first full moon of every month. I bring a suckling pig, a full-grown mammoth, and 35 slaves. I have the slaves and the mammoth fight each other, and then I eat the pig alive, and then I use all of this offal to drag the axe through, and at the end of that process, the axe starts weeping blood, and the blades glow from heat. Why does that happen? Am I a wizard? No. But my dad did it, and my dad's dad did it, and my dad's dad did it, and they wrote down how to do it, so now I do it so I can provide for the Norskins and for the Chaos Warriors these flaming, screaming axes. There we go. Again, it's like those traditional weapons, but we take it a little further. There's ritualism involved, there's sacrifice involved, there's death involved, violence in the creation of these weapons, beyond the simple ritualistic or traditional means that you saw with the traditional chaos weapons. It's not just tradition for tradition's sake, it's tradition because tradition works. Tradition is how the creation gets made. And then, of course, there is the more complex part of, well, if you actually have a wizard or you actually have some arcane knowledge of your own, you can ensorcel your own damn weapons, or you can receive them as a gift from your gods, which is another common thing. You were great and doing awesome in that battle, you hold up your axe in triumph, and all of a sudden, lightning strikes your axe from above, and instead of killing you and destroying your weapon, well, now your axe is imbued with lightning permanently. Thank you, Zeech. I really appreciate it. Now let me go cleave this man's skull in half in a really cool way with my lightning axe. Sometimes it's random. Sometimes it's very very process-oriented and procedural. So, it just depends. So, with that in mind, with that concept in mind, these are harder to create. Obviously, we're not just grabbing any random northern materials and cobbling them together into a blade shape and then calling it better than anything Kislev has ever made. No. We now have a process that must be followed meticulously or require active intervention from the gods or from magic, the winds of magic, in order to create these weapons. So, that being said, those are options. Those are actual ways that you can concretely get your hands on these weapons. Granted, it's expensive, granted it takes more time than traditional weapons, but that means that it can still be accessible to elites, units, or leaders, and often leaders will have these. For example, whenever you see sorcerers in the old world, especially chaos sorcerers, almost all of them are toting around a ensorcelled blade. Usually it's that kind of two-pronged at the tip, eye on the blade type of single-handed sword, and yeah, that's an ensorcelled weapon. It probably has a fire aura or something else of that type. Maybe lightning, maybe it spits acid or poison all over itself. Any of those things are perfectly reasonable because that's a sorcerer who knows his shit and can make his own darn weapons. Make your own luck, as they say. But this brings up an important point. We've been talking about swords, axes, and polearms. Why are no bows included here? Why are there no crossbows? Why are there no catapults? Well, I touched on it in the start of the video, but it's important for ensorcelled weapons. This process yields you a discrete result. For example, you couldn't maximize the process. Remember that thing that I said about the suckling pig, the sacrifices, and the mastodon? You couldn't just multiply that by 100 and then get 100 weapons out of it. It just doesn't work. We've tried. It only works once. Now that might be because of the fickle state of the winds of magic, or maybe the gods don't like being taken advantage of with the boons that they give us. Either way, it means that there's limitations here, and of course, what is primary to the weaponry of most Chaos Warriors? It's melee weapons. So, why no bows? Well, I mentioned it before. Are you going to say that the arrow fired from the bow is ensorcelled? Are you going to say that? Is it technically true? Can you really call ammunition from a chaotic weapon chaotic ammunition? What if you're using Kislevite ammo? What if you're using arrows made in the south, no longer made with those northern materials? Does your demonic or ensorcelled bow simply lose its potency? It's a good question, and it's honestly not one that most Chaos Forces are willing to gamble on. Not saying that they've never done it, just saying that you can see why the vast majority of people who actually get the value and expense needed to make ensorcelled weapons would probably pick a more reliable melee option rather than trying to go for a chaos bow of some kind, or crossbow, or artillery piece, etc. Now, there are examples and specific examples, but often those involve direct intervention from the gods, or, more commonly, actual magic, and not that more traditional method of ritualism. And then the second one, what about armor? Well, armor, I got you there. Armor is one of those things that gets ensorcelled a lot. Specifically, plate armor. Heavy plate armor like this and like this is ensorcelled quite commonly within Norscan ranks for two reasons. One, armor is hard to make. really hard to make. It's a lot of pieces, a lot of parts, it's very complicated, it's very expensive. However, enchanting the entire set can make it a lot more durable. However, again, caveat to that, does the person who's enchanting it actually know what they're doing? That's more of the concern, because if they only get the breastplate or the helmet or something else that they enchant, do you really need a right leg that is enchanted, or do you want the whole armor enchanted? Maybe that'll be a lot more difficult for you. Maybe it's not even possible. Maybe you don't have a smith who can do it, and maybe your sorcerer keeps turning the armor into something that eats you. It's really fickle, and because chaos magic is so difficult, it makes enchanting an entire set of armor a lot harder. You're kind of better off making this more traditionally, and then hopefully receiving a boon from the gods that enchants your armor plate. Again, there are examples of it, like with very high level armors, or with leadership units that manage to get an entire set of enchanted chaos plate. Chaos Knights, for example, will often have a breastplate and helmet that are both enchanted, but they don't necessarily have their greaves or their sabatons enchanted, necessarily. So it just depends what you want done and where. And again, the enchantments to the armor are extensive. There are ones that make you infested with plague, more durable, that have direct blessings from the gods. There's ones that make you feel like you're not wearing armor, that make it considerably lighter while still being incredibly protective. And then there are other ones which make your armor alive, light on fire, move for you like power armor, possess you like possessed. It's a lot of different things because the uses for armor are quite varied, unlike the uses for weapons, which are usually for killing people. Moving on to the last type, demon weapons, the weapons of demons, demonic weaponry. Well, unlike the previous ones, demon weapons are far more quote-unquote limited in form and function, but they are way, way, way more powerful. It is absolutely no stretch to say that a demon weapon in Warhammer the Old World and a demon weapon in Warhammer 40k are pretty close in terms of capability. So, a demon sword from 40k versus a demon sword from Thorska, I actually put those on a pretty similar field because at the end of the day they're using the same power source and the same direction. But why are they limited? Why is it far more limited? Well, demons don't want to just inhabit anything. Demons, for example, are very interested in being used. If they're going to be stuck inside of a sword or stuck inside of a shield, they don't want to just sit around all day. They don't want to be a greave or a piece of armor that isn't primary to your defense. You don't want to put a demon into your shoulder plate because what happens if they get bored? Well, they tend to wreak havoc trying to escape your armor and theoretically either destroying it or you in the process. You want to keep them happy, and if at all possible, you want to keep them in a form that can be contained and essentially thrown away from you if they become too dangerous. For this reason, weapons, especially melee weapons, shields, breastplates, and helmets are preferred, though a demonic helmet might be dangerous for that same trying to escape and accidentally crushing your skull like an eggshell situation. So, what does it include? It usually includes active consciousness, or at least some level of weapon autonomy, so an automatic function. For example, if you have a demon weapon that bursts into scoriating flames, or that shoots out magic of some kind, you aren't necessarily attached to the weapon mentally, or giving it orders or shouting "flame on" when you take your sword out. The demon knows that when it gets swung around, well, it's time to flame on. Automatic. It comes on when you want it to, not necessarily because you're willing your effect upon it, though that is also possible, especially with some lesser demonic weapons. It's also because the demon might be observing what's going on around you and deciding, yeah, it's time to fight. I'm going to light on fire. That's a perfectly reasonable thing for a demonic weapon to do. And the other part of this is, of course, that this contains demonic features, or impossible features or geometry. So impossible materials, stuff that's like, my sword is made out of emeralds. How does it not break? Demon weapon. It contains a demon of Nurgle. The emeralds melt inside of your body and turn into acidic slime. How does it work? It doesn't. Impossible geometry, impossible materials, impossible features of all of your weaponry, which is one of the reasons why demonic weapons are so hard to deal with, because how do you prepare for that? How do you, as a normal human, prepare for a sword or an axe like the Black Axe that breaks off in your body and starts seeking out internal organs to lacerate? How? How do you protect yourself against that? It's literally not fair because it's impossible. It's impossible to stop, and it's very, very difficult to resist these types of weaponry, which is why they're so darn powerful and so hard to get. Speaking of hard to get, these require multiple rituals or direct bargaining with demons. Now, in the old world, bargaining with demons is pretty much as hard as it is in any other scenario. Demons in the old world are quite hungry, and you are full of delicious things that the demon likes to eat. So convincing him to not only show up to your birthday party, but also give you a nice fancy gift of himself on a silver platter is quite difficult, and you better bring a lot of party favors if you want him to stick around in your weaponry and war gear. Again, you could consider it like an unfriendly house guest that you have to impress. For example, if you had your boss over for dinner and you wanted to make sure that he was comfortable and happy, you might break out the wine a little early and hope that he gets drunk enough that he doesn't notice that there's dust on your rug. That's pretty much the idea when it comes to bargaining with demons. You want to blind them with sacrifices, provide them everything that they want, give them your pedigree, and then stuff them inside of a sword as quickly as possible, so that they have less of a chance to change their mind and try and devour your soul. Usually, this is completely impossible to perfectly replicate. So you can't really make two demon weapons that are exactly the same unless you make them at the exact same time with the exact same demon. For example, akimbo demon weapons. Say if you were a worshiper of Zeech, and you made a pair of wands or staves or knives that were made out of two combined blue horrors, or two combined brimstone horrors even. So you took the original demon, you split it in half, weakened it, and then put both halves of it into a weapon using magic. Boom. They're probably going to be similar, or at least paired, and have similar abilities because it's the same demon. That's really, really hard to do. And if just getting one of these is so difficult, making another one of the same exact vein with a different demon, and again, in the old world, demons have far more personality, individuality, and separation from their gods than they do in every other setting. So when you have something that individualistic, that hungry, and that dangerous, it's quite difficult to predict what it will do, especially because once it inhabits the material, it has that autonomy. It has that ability to activate, to change, to choose its own abilities to a degree. It can essentially do whatever the Sam hell it wants inside of your sword. Make it a gross, disturbing lump, cause it to try and possess you, give you horrible mutations, cancer, whatever it wants, but generally, it wants what you want if you're a good follower of chaos. If you're a good little boy who likes to chop off skulls for corn, your axe is not going to try and cut your arm off. It's going to make you better at chopping other people's arms off, generally. Don't piss off your demon weapons. They are often sentient and do not like that shit. And what are the requirements? Well, almost always, it's a huge amount of sacrifice. Death in massive quantities, thousands of dead, huge services to the Chaos Gods, killing very, very important people, priests, leaders, lords, other enemy mages, any type of thing that could truly pull the eye of the Dark Gods in the old world, which, man, it's hard to do because there's a lot of evil shit going on in Norsca. That's one of the reasons why a lot of us fellow Chaos folks head further south into Kislev or even the Empire to go raid where those softy southerners are, so we can try and convince them that Sigmar is not a god by feeding their soul to an actual god. and reaping the benefits, of which demonic weapons are one. The other thing is demonic weapons are rarely given to you, and because they're around for a long time, some of them forever, especially a lot of the sentient ones, for example the King's Sword, which literally was a sentient thing that was ruling a Norscan tribe for a while, because they go around and they stay around for so darn long, yeah, they're rarely just a gift. You usually gotta work for it pretty hard. And one of the best ways to work for it pretty hard is to worship actively, which, of course, in the name of chaos, worshipping actively means killing a lot of people and committing them as sacrifices to your preferred dark god. And the other thing that's important here is weapon dedications. Demons have dedications. This isn't 40k, where we have gray areas and non-aligned demons running all over the place and chaos corruption everywhere. No, when a demon enters your weapon, it has a name, a serial number, and a P.O. box in the realms of chaos. And it follows that shit to the letter. It believes what it believes, and even if you disagree with it, it's the weapon. It'll do what it wants, for the most part, which is why that if a Flamer of Tzeentch decides to embody your armor, you better get real comfortable with Tzeentch worship real frickin' quick before it lights you on fire. Don't piss these things off. So, processing and creating a chaos weapon. Just as a recap, traditional, why would you want it? Well, they're everywhere. They're cheap, they're low cost, low impact on the environment, and they're relatively easy for you to get in large numbers. How do you get them? Follow the process. Now, you can go through more complicated or more simplistic processes. The simplest version of most of these weapons are just made with local supplies in the Norscan wastes. But there are, of course, much better ones. What do you get out of it? Weapons that inherently surpass their limitations in design. They are better than their rough or ramshackle or even eccentric design should technically allow them to be, making them somehow better than weapons that are made by better smiths with technically better materials. Ensorcelled weapons. Why would you do this? Well, there are a lot of elite weapons. They're for people who are very specialized and talented and have the money and resources to actually go and seek out someone who has the fairly complicated knowledge in order to make one. How do you make an ensorcelled weapon? Well, it involves some sort of actual active magic beyond the traditional. Now, this could be a traditional ritual or process that consistently yields a result, even if it's not a consistent one. Usually it's consistent, but it doesn't have to be. Or it could be actual magic, having a user of the winds perform a ritual or a spell on your weapon that literally changes it, that actively changes the way that it works or feels or operates in reality. What is the result? Well, it's a weapon with some sort of magical effect. Usually it's not quite powerful enough to be considered, godlike weaponry or anything, but it is unnatural. It defies reality. It certainly flies in the face of any of the, a little bit odd but quite traditional stuff that the traditional weapons have. They are beyond explanation in a vast majority of cases. Demonic. Why would you want these? Well, if you're a champion of the Dark Gods, or an aspiring champion of the Dark Gods, you would pray for a demon weapon. It's recognition, it's provision that you're doing the right thing. It's correct that you're on the right path and that the gods have seen what you're doing. How do you get it? Well, you gotta bargain, deal with the devil style with a demon from the realms of chaos. You gotta wine and dine and schmooze your boss in order to get some fancy snazzy upgrades to your favorite skull chopper. What do you get? Weapons that beyond defy reality. They have automatic capabilities with spell-like effects upon the weapon itself. They are completely inexplicable to reality, and they don't need to be. What is also great is that unlike ensorcelled or even some traditional weapons, they don't lose potency, because once the demon latches onto an item, it remains relatively powerful as long as you continue to feed it with chaos, whether that is killing people or whether that is leaving it in a chaotic area like the far north. It will remain afflicted by chaos. So, Why are these a good pick if they cost so much? Let's just look for a second at a speculative image. I want to break these down to give you an example of what these are and how you could point out traditional, ensorcelled, or demonic at a glance, let's say. Let's start with this one here. We can see some skulls, we can see some patterning, this Chris-like style here. I would call this an ensorcelled weapon. There's nothing on here that is particularly useless as a weapon. There's nothing really indicating that there are demons inside of it. Souls, perhaps, put upon it, because you can see these faces and these skulls. Perhaps that would be accurate, but this weapon looks to me definitely like an ensorcelled option. If I were to guess, due to the motif of the eagle eyes or the hawk eyes, this likely gives you an increase to your reaction speed and possibly to your fighting speed overall. It definitely seems like a one-handed weapon, like a Chris, so it could be designed as a dueling type of weapon. The next one we have here is definitely a demonic weapon, and there's a couple of them here. I would say this is demonic for two reasons. One, it has no blade on the lower sides. It's just got a bunch of spikes, a bunch of unreasonably shaped objects here that are clearly not traditional weapon things. There's clearly something about this blade, in my opinion, likely a projected energy or flame blade at the very front, but also you can see the demonic leer of the demon out in front. This would indicate to me that this is likely a demon weapon with something changed about its blade to make it no longer need this section of it. The next one here, I would likely say that this is also a demonic blade, and of course it is easy to see here, the bird head, the bird feet, the wings. This is a blade of Zeech, and to me, it makes a lot of sense because you can see that it is not designed for two-handed use. This is a plunging dagger type of weapon, and you can see that from barely having any blades and having a very sharp, almost spade or arrow-shaped tip. This is a weapon that excels at stabbing people in the back, at assassination, and, in my opinion, at one-hit kills. I can see this very much being a weapon that injects or discharges some level of killing energy or spell into a target so that when you sacrifice an enemy or you stab a buddy in the back, this weapon feeds off of it and empowers you in some way. The next one here is another very simple one. I would say that this is much more your traditional weapon. The sunburst, the heavy head, the hammerhead, the langettes, everything about this kind of spells classic chaos traditional weapon, and I think that there's probably not anything different about this. It's likely just that slightly higher capability, durability than it technically should be. Now, it could be a little bit lighter if that's not an axe blade, but rather a hammer blade, but whatever, potato, potato, that's definitely a traditional weapon. Now we get to another demonic weapon, and you can see here what I was talking about. Smoke effects, a beating heart, these demonic claws or scales, this spiky handle. This is clearly a traditional weapon at one point that has been possessed by a creature of the realms of chaos, and has now mutated, I would assume, to do something similar to, like I said, where it heats up the blades to an incredible temperature and then slices through armor like it's made out of butter. Here, we likely have a traditional weapon. Now, why do I say it's traditional? I say that because it has these chinks and cracks. Indications of damage or destruction to the weapon indicates that it's traditional. Why? That's because ensorcelled weapons having magic do not tend to deteriorate in this way unless they're kept out of the realms of chaos for a long period of time, at which point they lose some of their potency. So I think this is likely a traditional weapon with probably no difference to it other than the fact that it has all these extra gubbins and bits on it. You can see many spikes, the cross-hatching of kind of bone teeth, all that kind of stuff. Down here we have 3 scythes or war picks, and I think in order we have a demonic one pretty obvious here. It's definitely got some sort of magic to it because it is greenish. I would say that perhaps it enwraps the creature in foliage. Like you can see here, this kind of vine spiral. It could do something like entangle or growth that casts upon the creature. Or maybe it's even supposed to be something like tentacles you can see here at the head. So maybe it has some imbued spells within it, gives you some spell casting ability in addition to being a demon weapon. Then we have here what I would definitely call an ensorcelled blade. You can see once more the shredded bits, the sharpened sections that are certainly unnatural and do not fit natural proportions for a weapon, and then this horrifying saw blade for a scythe or a comma or a war pick, whatever this is, and this is definitely indicative of an ensorcelled weapon. I would say that if this had some magical property, it would likely be the ability to withdraw and replace those blades, or to have them move slowly within a cut, or maybe even just that they are incredibly sharp and they will dig into a target and rip out like a chainsaw, giving it a brutal downward hit. For here, I think we have the upper end of traditional weapons. I love this one very much because you can see it's made with those reinforced pieces. There's nothing particularly ethereal or special about them, unlike this scythe. And it is clearly an armor-cracking scythe, not a bladed scythe like these two. I think this is one of the top-end traditional ones, probably made with some level of ritual or traditional methods, and it is designed specifically as an armor breaker. It is a plate cracker. That's the whole point, which is why it's got this forward-facing nose or hooked beak design to crack through enemy plate armor for the Dark Gods. Then we have two more definitive demon-possessed weapons. Now, it should be obvious here. This, again, you could call it an ensorcelled weapon, and in Warhammer 40k, this is the design for ensorcelled weapons. But I have two reasons for calling it a demon weapon. One, this ball at the bottom. It clearly is filled with something, likely some power of some sort, or perhaps it's the resort of the demonic creature that lives within here. And the second part is these vents. These vents indicate, at least to me, that this weapon is supposed to be wreathed in flame. And given that it's not actively wreathed in flame at the moment, that indicates that it's an automatic effect. Now remember, if you have a weapon that's wreathed in flame and it's an ensorcelled weapon, it will simply remain wreathed in flame, or you'll have to light it on fire yourself before it lights up. Now, that doesn't mean that it could go out, or that you could put it out and then relight it again. Perhaps it has to go inside, but it isn't like a demon weapon like this, where it will actively ignite itself when it sees the need to do so. Much more of the automatic, autonomous thing there. Technically, it could go either way. I'm just speculating and giving you an example of where that dichotomy changes. Then the next one here is one of my favorites. I had mentioned before, crystal blades. A massive amethyst blade. I love amethyst. One of my absolute favorite gemstones. My other one is emeralds. I love both of them. But this is very indicative of a demon weapon. Again, ensorcelled weapons are quite durable, but they're not quite to the level of durability where you can just be smashing someone over the head with a crystal and expect it to not get damaged somewhat, especially from long use. Again, likely with these, the crystalline nature of it is going to mean that it cuts like a razor, incredibly thin, and even these little lightning lines might be indicative of some sort of spell contained within the weapon as well. And then finally, we get to this face axe here. Now, arguably, you could call this an ensorcelled weapon, and I normally would, except for one thing. There's a face here, and that face seems to have something indicating that it drinks blood. Now, that could be an ensorcelled weapon, or a demonic one. I am on the side of this being ensorcelled. Essentially, the one effect that this would have is that the more blood that it drinks, the faster it swings, because this is a very light, one-handed, fast-swinging axe, unlike these absolute monsters up here. And it clearly indicates to me that as this fills up with all its wrinkles and crackles and such, the blade would simply engorge and become far more violent and quick to action, as it were. A kind of progressive bonus to your fighting style, and that is also fairly common with chaos weaponry. So, that is the end of this video. Please note, and acknowledgements of all the good memes, there is a new vote up alongside this being the start of a new series. Again, I have one more video to do. I have to do the second part of our adversaries, so the vote will be up after that. However, this is the start of a new series, which is the Chaos series. This one's not going to be voted on as heavily. There will be stuff that I choose to put in here on occasion, but it's mostly going to be focused on chaos, chaos lore, worship, cults, all that type of stuff. However, I do want your input on our campaign so far. I would really like people who have gotten a chance to comment on it or look at it to give me some feedback on that. But other than that, other than lovingly commenting on this video and appreciating, as I know you all will, please comment, like, vote, subscribe, and I wish you all a lovely good night.